All right, here we are. This is the very last of the AP lectures, or of the U.S. History main lectures. Of course, later on, I'm playing with some ideas for doing some more in-depth lectures that'll be a lot shorter, about 5 or 10 minutes long, focusing on individual things. But for right now, we're going to wrap this up the same way we started it, with a broader, kind of idea of the history. And today, what we're going to deal with is, well, what does stuff look like today? What are some of the challenges that we've faced in the last 10 years or so, and what are we looking for as far as the future is concerned? So let's jump right into that and take a look. This is lecture 56. Today's challenges, and so what we're going to do is analyze the immediate history and how it relates to contemporary life and to future challenges. Probably the most immediate thing to take place during the last 10 years has to do with the economic crash that took place in 2008, and of course, all of us are kind of aware of where we stand economically. We know that we're somewhat on economic, relatively shaky economic ground, even though things have improved significantly since 2008. But what happened? How did this major economic event that took place relatively recently shape where we are today, and what are the consequences of this in the future? So let's take a closer look at this crisis. So, of course, during the last lecture, we talked about the Bush administration. We talked about some of the things that were going on in the opening decade of the new millennium, and among the things that was happening during this time, of course, we were fighting 2 wars at the same time, and we had just come out of an economic slump as a result of the breaking of the tech bubble in 2000, and we were experiencing a period of relatively slow economic growth. But things didn't seem all that bad at the time, largely as a result of the price of housing, the value of housing. And so we have this graph over here, which kind of gives us an idea of housing values. People were still, even though wages had not increased, and for regular Americans, we were still producing an awful lot of stuff, and we were able to get access to that stuff because of credit. We were able to go into debt and more or less handle that debt in order to get the new great stuff that's coming out, such as cell phones and new kinds of computers, laptops, all these wonderful, cool things. And one of the things that was driving all of this debt was the value of housing. The value of houses kept increasing and increasing, and as you can kind of see, it increased. This line here represents the value of houses up until the crash, and as you can see, prices are going up relatively steadily. Now, the problem, of course, is what we were able to do was, on a personal level, many people were able to get access to their houses. The values of their houses were going up, and of course, to mitigate some of the fact that their wages weren't necessarily increasing all that much, sometimes what we would do, to help get the kids to college or to deal with the expenses that we have, was to remortgage our houses. So sometimes houses, because the value of the houses were increasing, banks were willing to take out second mortgages on those houses and things along those lines. Another issue that happened is that because the housing values were increasing, it was a good investment. And these investments, not to make this way too complicated, but these investments, when a bank made a loan, offered a mortgage to people, then the banks would turn around and sell that mortgage to a securities company. So consequently, the bank no longer really held the mortgage. They didn't take an awful lot of risk. The securities companies were willing to take on that risk because the value of the houses kept going up and up. And then they packaged those into other deals, and then those deals were broken down and packaged into other deals. And pretty soon you have a tremendous amount of people whose job it was to make investments are doing an awful lot of investing in stuff that is based on these mortgages, and these mortgages increasing and increasing and increasing. This, of course, is going to encourage, because the banks are taking very little risk, this, of course, is going to allow banks to invest more in housing and to put out more loans, and to even put out riskier loans. So things such as subprime loans, or stuff that was called ninja, oh, you can't see it there, ninja loans, no income, no job, approved. this is what we were doing. So we were putting this out, and of course, when you do this, this also continues to inflate the value of the houses. Unfortunately, what's going to end up happening is, with Americans going further and further into debt, and the value of the houses continuing to rise and rise, you get to a point where people are simply just not willing to invest in houses anymore. The values of the houses get to the point where people are, you know what, no, the value of the house is going too far. And of course, the result of this is going to be a burst of this bubble. So, whoa, that was kind of interesting. So housing values collapse. And now think about this. Now, at this time, you have an awful lot of investment companies that were invested in stuff that was backed in mortgages, mortgage-backed securities. And once those mortgages hit the bucket, they went out. Now, a lot of these banks, because the Glass-Steagall Act had been repealed by the Financial Reform Act in 1999, well, a lot of this money that was invested was, in fact, money that was federally insured. Make a long story short, major investment firms such as Lehman Brothers, of course, being probably the first really big one going out of business, and then others following their assets, turning to garbage in front of them, and those companies going out of business. And ultimately what's going to end up happening is, toward the end of 2008, we're going to see businesses that they're no longer willing to invest, and if you're no longer willing to invest, guess what ends up happening? Well, we end up with high unemployment. The unemployment rate goes up. So people start losing their jobs. People start losing their jobs. They can't pay their mortgages if they have mortgages. Some people had subprime mortgages, and those mortgages started to inflate in value. So all of a sudden, we have this kind of death spiral, the kind of death spiral that we had in the Great Depression. Now, wait a minute, we have a Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve Bank should be able to take care of this, right? Wrong. In order to kind of keep the economy pumping and in order to keep access to credit available, the Federal Reserve had very, very low interest rates already. Well, what happens what is the Federal Reserve supposed to do when there's a time of economic contraction or recession? Well, what they do is they lower interest rates. But what happens if the interest rates are so low that the Federal Reserve can't lower them anymore? Yeah, that's a problem, right? So this was going on. There was really nothing to stop this. And so we can kind of see real gross domestic product takes a dip, and here what we have is something that economists have been calling the Great Recession. It is the worst economic catastrophe since the Great Depression. Fortunately, there were still some avenues available that come out of the New Deal that helped keep the economy afloat, such as FDIC. There wasn't a bank run because of FDIC. So there were some things that were in place that kept the economy from totally collapsing the way it had collapsed during the Great Depression, but we came awfully close. One of the things that is going to be put into effect is called the TARP, or the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Okay, this was put into effect in 2008. Many people, mistakenly apply this to President Obama. President Obama did not have anything to do with the TARP necessarily, but we're going to talk about what Obama did, although much of the TARP funds are going to be managed by the Obama administration at this point. And the TARP is going to be about a $700 billion bailout of investment firms and investment banks. They're taking this money, and the goal is to keep those banks afloat. Unfortunately, it did the trick. It kept the banks afloat, but also the understanding was, well, if these banks can stay afloat, and of course this is a huge taxpayer giveaway to the banks, maybe the banks would be a little bit nicer to the mortgage holders who were about to lose their houses as a result of this recession. Yeah, that didn't happen. So they got this huge bailout, but we're not willing to pass that bailout on down to their mortgage holders. So people started losing houses left, right, and backwards, and this is, of course, going to further deflate the value of houses. I mean, if you're trying to sell a house on a block that already has 5 houses that don't have anybody in them, you're not going to be able to sell your house. I mean, you're not going to be able to sell your house at the value, especially if you bought that house before the recession, where the values of that house were very, very high. So, the economy just kind of, the bottom just kind of fell out of the economy. Now, this is 2008, remember? So this is an election year. which leads us up to the election of 2008, which is probably one of our more historic elections, of course, because we see elected the first African-American man elected into office. It was really quite an amazing thing. But how did this happen, right? A lot of it, we're going to give President Obama a tremendous amount of credit for running a really, really powerful campaign and being charismatic. He does jump in when the economy collapses. He jumps in and he plays a leadership role in trying to help resolve some of these issues, and it makes him look pretty good. But we also have to remember that the person getting blamed for this economy is going to be the Bush administration. Is that necessarily fair? Not entirely. I mean, we can kind of argue that banks and investment firms were able to do things that they otherwise would not have been able to do had the Bush administration been more responsive and more willing to enforce some of the existing laws and to use some of the existing regulations to kind of keep them tamped down, which of course he didn't. But on the other hand, this was not necessarily a Bush issue. But Bush is definitely going to take the fall for this. And to a certain extent, the deregulation that Bush was a part of, that conservative move to deregulate, especially deregulating the finance markets, is going to play a role in the creation of this recession. So we can't necessarily pin all the blame on President Bush. We can pin it on the probably administrations going all the way back to Jimmy Carter, and we can apply this to blame it on the deregulation policies of that particular time period. We can also blame it on the fact that that going into finance and financing debt became a much better asset to Americans than financing things like manufacturing and industry. There's a whole bunch of that. This is a relatively complex issue, but the bottom line is President Bush and the Republican Party is going to bear most of the blame for the fall of this economy, and that is going to be a huge handicap for the Republican candidate, a fellow by the name of John McCain. Now, John McCain had great credentials as the president was concerned. He had a tremendous amount of experience in the Senate. He was a war hero. So he was a pretty viable candidate for president, but he is going to be saddled with this economy. He's also, I'm sorry I'm going to have to say it, but he's also going to be saddled by whom he chose as his vice presidential candidate. A woman by the name of Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin, I'm really not sure why he chose Sarah Palin, but I think it was probably to kind of attract the more conservative elements of the Republican Party. John McCain was not known to be, exceptionally conservative. So he's got to do something to try to attract the conservative vote, and he chooses Sarah Palin. Unfortunately, Sarah Palin was the governor of Alaska, not an awful lot of experience, certainly no experience in the national spotlight, and she really did not campaign very well. She was not particularly well informed on the issues, and she was kind of a drag on the campaign. And of course, it looks like that she may have kind of gone her own way and didn't necessarily do the things that the McCain campaign asked her to do or expected her to do. Either way, in 2008, President-elect Obama, at this point, it's clear we almost see kind of a remake of 1860 when you take a look at the graph here, with the exceptions of Virginia and North Carolina that went for Obama. President Obama, of course, gets the heavily populated states in the Northeast and the Midwest and the West Coast. McCain gets the South and the Western states. And wham, we've got our first African-American president. Now, he's coming in, of course, to a mess. A huge mess, and he's got to figure out how to fix it. And sometimes we kind of forget the kind of mess that this fellow inherited. Among the very first things that he's going to do is institute a stimulus. In other words, he's going to kind of do a tiny version of what Franklin Roosevelt did, and that he's going to put money, just federal money, into the marketplace to try to turn this recession around. The economy was in free fall. This stimulus was about $700 billion or so, $600 billion, not all of which ultimately did get spent. Much of this was actually in the form of tax cuts, and we know that tax cuts are somewhat stimulative, but some of it was actually being sent to preserve people's jobs. Among the jobs that were preserved were teacher jobs. In 2009, I lost my job as a teacher teaching in a private school and was unable to find work until the stimulus came in, which loosened up funds to allow teachers to get hired. So that I got a little bit of a bias here with regard to the stimulus. So then the question then becomes, well, did the stimulus work? Well, we could go back to our graph here and take a look. If we take a look at the recession here, what we'll find is that the bottom of the trough of this graph is actually when the stimulus was applied. And as you can see, after this point, we actually see that the economy is growing. However, we also see that the economy is not growing nearly as fast as the economy fell, right? Slope of the line is different. So this is a problem. So on the one hand, we do see that the stimulus does have an effect. It does stop the free fall. It does start to turn the economy around. On the other hand, it was not a V-shaped recovery as many people were expecting. Many economists were saying that, well, the problem is that the stimulus was simply too small. It wasn't big enough to deal with the issues at the time. So we do have the stimulus. Now, during this time period, of course, there were an awful lot of folks. We still have a lot of folks who are feeling this this kind of old laissez-faire style, and they were very, very concerned. I mean, Obama had a reputation. They were fearful that he was a very liberal, left-leaning Democrat. He really wasn't. But this was a fear. This was a concern. And of course, the concern was that that President Obama and the Democratic Congress at that time was going to raise taxes and start over-regulating the businesses. And many of these guys are going to start a counter movement to try to keep this to kind of keep this tax and spend liberal, as they believed, under control. This movement became known as the Tea Party. It's probably one of the most significant political movements of our time. You know, the idea on this is we don't raise our taxes, and of course, to a certain extent, they're correct. The last thing that you want to do during a time of an economic recession is to raise people's taxes. So we do have this issue here with regard to what are we going to do? How is the government going to get the money to pay for you know, the stimulus and all the things that the government needs to do during this particular recession? And of course, this particular saying, well, let's cut entitlement programs. Let's cut you know, things that the government is quote unquote wasting money on. And of course, the Democratic Party is not willing to do that. And so we have this conflict going on, this political conflict about how to handle this particular recession and how to handle things like entitlements and all of the costs that the government has taken on. And of course, these costs did seem to be kind of run away. In the beginning part of President Obama's administration and during the Democratic Congress, we do see very high deficits. We do see the debt increasing very relatively rapidly. Of course, then there's always the element of these that kind of take it further to an extreme. But you know, I don't want to tend to normalize those particular radical elements. Now, another thing that's really going to fire this group up is among the promises that President Obama made when he was running. One of the reasons why a lot of people voted for him was health care reform. The cost of health care had increased tremendously over the years now. So for a number of reasons, one, an awful lot of our healthcare was being done by high-tech ways, and some of these high-tech ways were very expensive. But also think about the demand for healthcare. The United States was it has a relatively free market with regard to healthcare. Our healthcare is oftentimes paid through insurance companies, and the cost and the value of that healthcare was increasing. Also, our society was getting older, which means typically more health problems. There's a whole bunch of reasons, but the bottom line is that the cost and the value of healthcare was steadily increasing, and of course, wages weren't, which is a real problem. If if healthcare is increasing faster than your income, which it does, then healthcare takes a bigger bite of your income every single paycheck. And that's a real problem. So people were demanding health care reform. So the President Obama and the Democrats in Congress, of course, take the lead on this, although many people, myself included, kind of criticize the president for not taking as much of a leadership role. He kind of let Congress define how this debate is going to be run. And quite frankly, he kind of let this debate play out. This may have had something to do with a little bit of his own inexperience at the time. Consequently, a health care proposal was produced, and it was passed, and it becomes known as Obamacare. And of course, this was horrible. Of course, this was presented by the Tea Party and the folks who supported the Tea Party as socialized medicine, and the government is taking over health care. That's not true. The doctors were still private. Many of the hospitals were still private. The only thing that was really, governed by the state is the fact that you have to buy health care insurance at this stage of the game. The government is going to force you to buy health insurance. Well, wait a minute. How can the government force you to buy anything? That is a trespass against our constitutional rights. We should be able to buy whatever we want to buy. We can't be forced to buy health care by the federal government. Well, the argument there is, well, one of the things that we've got going for us is before Obamacare, if you had insurance and you got really, really sick, you could find yourself kicked off of your insurance, or your premiums go up so high that you can't pay for your insurance any longer, and you find yourself losing your insurance when you're at your sickest. We also have people who are locked into jobs because they needed their health care, and if they quit their jobs, they would lose their benefits, and then when they went to get new benefits, any health conditions that they had before they got those new benefits, the insurance company is no longer going to pay for. Well, the government is going to say, you can't do that. Now, if you're an insurance provider, you have to provide insurance, and you've got to cover everything. You can't say, I'm not going to cover pre-existing conditions. Well, if that's the case, then what's to stop me, a relatively healthy guy, from saying, well, I'm simply not going to buy insurance until I get sick. And then once I get sick, I will buy insurance, and then the insurance company has to cover me because it's the law. So consequently, the Democrats are going to put into effect an individual mandate. And I'm saying Democrats because it was exclusively Democrats that voted for this thing. The Republicans did not vote for health care. They did not vote for Obamacare. So this is wholly owned by the Democratic Party at this stage of the game. So Obamacare becomes a big source of contention. And ultimately, this is going to lead in 2010 to the 2010 election in which the Republican Party is going to take over the House of Representatives in a big way. And many of these folks who are taking over the House of Representatives were very, very right-wing. They were your right-wing Tea Party Republicans. In fact, they oftentimes unseated even more moderate Republicans in taking over. And what we then have is we kind of have loggerheads. We also... Democrats also lose seats in the Senate, even though they did not necessarily lose the Senate, but they did lose a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, which meant that that anything that came up that the Democrats wanted to get passed, the Republican Party could simply filibuster, which basically means stop it from demanding cloture on the vote. It used to mean getting up and giving a speech until you couldn't speak anymore. And now it simply means that we're going to demand that we're not going to allow this to come to a vote unless you get a 60-vote majority to let it come to a vote. It's called cloture. And the Republican Party was not going to let that happen. And in fact, the number of filibusters increased at just about exponentially come 2010, blocking passage of just about any of President Obama's and the Democrats' initiatives during this time. We also see that the economy, people are still suffering from this economy. Even though the recession itself was over, the recovery wasn't benefiting people. And people were getting very, very angry and outraged. They became outraged from the fact that taxpayers spent billions of dollars to bail out big businesses, big corporations. And presumably these big corporations were actually the cause for the fall of these of the economy. I mean, it wasn't the individual, people were working hard. Productivity was up. It wasn't everyday people's fault. It was the fault of these investment firms that were investing irresponsibly and caused this economic collapse. And yet they got a huge bailout. And in fact, many of those companies, not only did they get these huge bailouts, but they spent millions, in fact billions of dollars, giving bonuses to the very executives who screwed everything up and caused the collapse. This outraged people, in all walks of life, not just liberals or left-leaning, but also libertarians and other groups. And they decide that they're also going to start to protest. They're not seeing the jobs coming. They're not seeing the economic growth. They're seeing their wages fall. They're seeing political deadlock taking place in Congress, and they're just getting outraged. And eventually, a group of folks decided that they were going to go to Wall Street, and they were going to pitch their tents in the middle of what was called Zuccotti Square. It became known as Liberty Square. And they were going to pitch their tents, and they weren't going to leave Wall Street until there were Wall Street reforms that were put into place. Now, to be fair, there was a Wall Street reform that was put into place called the Dodd-Frank Act that is going to regulate some of Wall Street's actions, but it was largely recognized as being a relatively weak milquetoast kind of law. And now that we can debate that, but this was the perception of these particular guys. Their mantra became, we are the 99%. We are not the wealthy 1% that is getting the bailouts and that is benefiting. Don't forget, by 2010, many of these companies were actually starting to make record profits again. And these folks weren't. And this became known as the Occupy Wall Street movement. And the Occupy Wall Street movement is going to have a lot of different issues that these guys want to address. These are all young people in this particular park. And this Occupy movement spreads all over the place. Spread to cities all over, including my home city, where I actually got to participate in this Occupy movement to a certain extent. So this was really, really powerful stuff. It was a very powerful movement at the time. In fact, the Occupy movement is going to actually spread internationally, and in fact, it may even have helped being a catalyst for the Arab Spring that's going to happen in and around the same time. So we end up with this movement, and we end up with this mantra, and even though this particular movement had people as diverse as libertarians on one end of the political spectrum and anarchists on the other end of the political spectrum and everything in between, this movement was very much involved in and interested in the idea of economic justice and economic equity, and the fact that that there are some people who benefit from society more than other people, and maybe we need to get back into leveling the playing field a little bit more. So this movement was huge. Ultimately, this movement will be basically broken up by the police quite aggressively and assertively. We also saw student movements taking place, such as this one here in Berkeley, in which students are getting kind of outraged with the fact that their tuition keeps increasing. Wages aren't going up. There's not as much money to pay for college education, and everybody knows at this point in time, if you want to get a decent job, you've got to have that college education, which means taking out tremendous loans, which means going into debt. And many of these college students are facing the fact that when they get out of college in their brand new professions, they're not going to actually be able to enjoy the fruits of those possessions. They're not going to be able to go out and buy a new house. They're not going to be able to buy a new car. They're going to have to pay off their student loans first. And we can make an argument that this is very much a drag on the economy. So many of these folks started to protest this, and the response was, in some cases, much brutal. This actually is going to become a meme during the time. A police officer macing. Very often these movements were very brutally put down by the police. And this, of course, is going to only get the fire going even more. So you see a tremendous amount of political polarization. To a certain extent, this polarization still exists. And what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do with it? Is a question for the day. We do see this is actually a pretty, great period for movement politics. Many of my students are wondering, well, what happened to that energy in the 60s, all these movements? Well, guess what? It's still around. People are still involved in these movements. And we also have to understand that the movements that we talked about in the 1950s and 1960s didn't work overnight. So some of these movements are a couple years old. I mean, they've built up and they've become apparent. So for instance, the Dreamer movement that we see started to develop during this time. Immigration started to be, we started to get really fearful of immigration in the 2000s. Again, we kind of went through this isolationist kind of thing, to the point where we actually built this big ridiculous wall, across the Mexican-American border. Humiliating kind of a thing. Well, what do? Of course, this wall had the effect of simply people who did come to the United States without documentation.
Tatiana Castro, if you're on campus, please report to the front of the school. Tatiana Castro, if you're on campus, please report to the front of the school. Your ride is waiting.
So, anyway, sorry about that. So what this wall effectively did is those undocumented immigrants who were in the United States now realized that it is now riskier to leave the country, because then now there's a big wall and they're not necessarily going to be able to get back in, or they're going to have to pay more to get back in. So what ends up happening is those undocumented immigrants, instead of going back home and then coming back, and they just stayed in the United States. So it ended up actually kind of increasing the number of undocumented workers and undocumented immigrants in the United States. Many of these folks were folks whose parents were undocumented, but they were born in the United States, so technically they were American citizens. Now, this has been referred to as anchor babies. Of course, this is a ridiculous concept. Having a child in the United States means that the child can stay in the United States. The child is an American citizen. You can't. You're not an American citizen. So we were seeing, even under the Obama administration, we were seeing families being split up, babies staying in the United States, moms and dads being brought back to their home countries. It was a terrible thing. So a Dreamer movement is going to be put into effect. Let's try to open some of these kids who are kind of here. Undocumented. Think about kids who were in between. Think about kids who were only children when their parents came and brought them illegally. They were children. They had no idea that they were illegally traveling, to another country. I'm 2 or 3 years old. I'm not a citizen, but now I'm an undocumented immigrant, but I had nothing to do with being an undocumented immigrant. Well, what do we do with those folks? And, of course, many of them grew up in the United States. They are proficient English speakers. They are, they're American. They're Americans. Culturally, they are Americans. They just don't have a piece of paper that says you're an American. Well, what do we do with them? And, of course, some people are just saying, you know what, let's just forget it and let them be Americans and call it a day. And then other people are saying, no, they gotta, they're on the wrong side of the river, baby. They gotta go. We have a bunch of debate in between that. So this is part of this the idea of movement politics. Madison, we had a huge movements in Madison. Developing when the governor there decided to shut down and basically disempower the unions in that state, which has a very strong union following. We see movements, the environmentalist movement. Of course, a plan was put into effect to bring really, really harsh tar sands in from Alberta, Canada, and bring them down into Texas to be refined and then shipped off elsewhere in the world. And of course, the fear is that this pipeline could rupture and leak and then seep into the Ogallala Aquifer and become a huge problem. This is the Keystone XL pipeline. We're also seeing that, hey, look, we've gotten to the point where it is clear we can no longer really deny the fact that the Earth is getting warmer, and we are the reason why. And even if we're, we've really got to do something. So even if we're addicted to oil, as every president since Richard Nixon has said we are addicted to oil, maybe we really need to be taking another look at that particular addiction. So the environmental movement has been growing. Probably the most successful movement during this period is the movement for gay and lesbian rights, the LGBT movement that's developing. Of course, these guys came up especially during a time of war. One of the things that they went after was this "don't ask, don't tell" policy that had been put into effect under President Clinton, saying, "Hey, that's not fair. It's causing gay people in the armed forces to be targeted." And of course, for the last 10 years, we've been talking about how we respect and how we love our troops, love our troops, love our troops. Does that hold for our gay troops? And if it does, then you're going to have to get rid of this "don't ask, don't tell" policy, which meant that basically "don't ask, don't tell" said, hey, look, if you're gay, you can be in the army, but you can't tell anybody you're gay, because if we know you're gay, then we're going to have to kick you out. So it's, well, that's not really fair. And another aspect of this is the idea of gay marriage. That, wait a minute, if men and women can get married and have all of the benefits of marriage, then why shouldn't gay couples be able to get married as well? And they're making their claim that this is something that they should be able to do. And currently in, I want to say about 20 states or 20 some odd states, we do have this movement. And we also have the Supreme Court taking a look at federal restrictions on gay marriage, the Protection of Marriage Act. So this has been a very, very successful, very powerful movement for their time. As we were talking about before, this is the environment. So this is an interesting little graph here to kind of give you an idea of where we stand. If you take a look at this, these are the hottest years on record, and this graph goes down to the lowest, and then of course it has each one of these is color-coded so that you can see the dark red is years between 2011, the lighter red is between 2001, 2010, and what do you see? Well, pretty much all of the red is, all of the hottest years on record were pretty much within the last 15 years, with the possible exception of it looks like this is 1998. It is clear that global warming is happening. It's real. Those scientists in the who were talking about this at the end of the 20th century, and people were like, nah, that's a bunch of nonsense. Well, it turns out that the scientists kind of knew what they were talking about, and we're actually starting to see some of the predictions that these folks were making back then are starting to come to fruition. Of course, it doesn't help when you have a situation like happened in 2010 when the British Petroleum oil well in the Gulf of Mexico slipped. It actually blew up. And that caused the well to disconnect from its wellhead, from the hole that is actually in the ground where they get the oil. And when that happens, well, guess what? It's kind of like taking the cap off of a bottle that you just shook, a soda bottle that you just shook. All of this oil that is under tremendous, tremendous amount of pressure because, oh, I don't know, the world is pressing down on it, starts to spew out into the Gulf of Mexico. Millions of gallons of oil spewing out into the Gulf of Mexico. And it took months to shut this thing down. The bottom line is we had the technology to get down in and make the hole. We didn't have the technology to fill the hole. And we had to figure that out. Ultimately, fortunately for the Gulf of Mexico, we did, but that oil is still out there. We're still dealing with the mess that was made by this particular oil company. So oil companies were not particularly popular after that. We're also seeing some of the effects of global warming taking place right here at home right now. Currently, even as I speak, as I'm writing this, California is pretty much turning into a desert. It is drying out, and they're having huge problems, huge droughts, and they're underwater restrictions. And guess what? This drought has spread now. The last time I read the newspaper, we're talking about current contemporary facts that are going to be the history for your children or your grandchildren or whatever, however old you are. This drought, as of the last time I read the paper, has spread now into Washington State. So we're looking at tremendous, tremendous social change that's going to accrue. What will the consequences of this global warming be? And the answer is, we really don't know, but it's probably not going to be good. So we're going to have to deal with that. The reality is that we're going to have to figure out a way to deal with it. We're either going to have to change our lifestyle, or we're going to have to learn to adapt to a much, much hotter world. Which it may be easier for some than for others. Of course, if you live in Colorado, yeah, it may be a little bit easier. I do not live in Colorado. I live in Florida, and my home is approximately, 4 to about 8 feet over sea level. So that could be a problem for me. Moving along, of course, as a result of 9/11, the United States passed what was called the USA Patriot Act and the National Security Act, an amendment to the National Security Act. And what this Patriot Act does is, among many things, it's a huge, huge bill, but among the things that it does is it expands the ability of the federal government to surveil and to collect data on you, me, your mom, everybody. Okay, and they're doing that, and they can do, and a lot of this surveillance and data gathering is stuff that they can do without a warrant, according to the USA Patriot Act. Well, wait a minute, we do have rights to privacy, and yes, we do have rights to privacy. The Constitution calls it, we have a right to be secure in our papers and personal effects. That's privacy. Back in the 18th century, when they were writing the Constitution, they would not have used the word privacy, because privacy was a reference to using the bathroom or the toilet, and that was not something that was going to be written into the Constitution. So they used the term being secure in your papers and personal effects. So as Americans, we do have a right to privacy, but at the same time, we also have an expectation of safety. We don't want to be killed by terrorists or by anybody else. And to what extent does the government have the right to look into our personal effects to keep us safe? And at what point are we crossing a line and moving into a trespass against those privacy rights? And this has been a tremendous debate, especially since the revelations that were put out by this fellow here, a guy by the name of Edward Snowden. He's going to release thousands of documents that were being kept by the NSA and other intelligence agencies. Is going to be dumped into a group called WikiLeaks and then disseminated out. And a lot of people who have been writing. We're still looking at these papers today to see the extent of just how much the federal government really does, surveil us, whether we consider that a trespass or not. So now Edward Snowden, of course, was kind of had to flee the country because of this, and he is currently living in Russia, fearful of coming back to his home country because of this release of information, none of which, by the way, was top secret or confidential, but still pretty embarrassing. So to what extent is this a trespass? Now, on the other hand, is something that I like to call democratic surveillance. One of the things that is going on in our country is that everybody has a cell phone. Right now I'm using a tablet to video this particular lecture. I've used a cell phone before. It wasn't particularly good, but it did the trick. So anyway, we are all walking around with little personal video cameras everywhere, and guess what? We have, of late, turned it on the state. We've turned it on, for instance, on police who are doing things that we think are questionable. Or we're turning it on police because we think it's kind of cool watching somebody get arrested, and then all of a sudden we see somebody get their head beat, and we're like, oh, wait a minute, that's pretty bad. And then it gets to the newspaper. So we're talking about surveillance from the top down, and that's very, very dangerous. But what about surveillance from the bottom up, when citizens can actually turn the cameras on the state and watch what the state is doing? Of course, this is a huge thing for me in my field of sociology in dealing with the works of Michel Foucault, who talked about surveillance and the surveillance state and the panopticon state, a state in which a society in which the state can be watching you at any given time, and you have no idea when and how you're being watched. That's the idea of the panopticon. But Foucault did not ever imagine the idea of a democratic form of surveillance, the ability of the people to turn the cameras on the leadership and on the authorities. So how is that going to pan out? Or will we just continue to watch cat videos on Facebook? We also take a look at this war on terror, and this war on terror sounded like a good idea at the time. We'd been attacked, 9/11, it was really, really bad. We go to war in Afghanistan, yay us, we blow up Afghanistan. Now what? We blow up Iraq, now what? And this war, and yet the terrorists is still kind of out there. And in fact, in Iraq right now, a group that we have designated terrorist, a group called ISIL, has started causing a lot of problems. And they're a brutal, brutal bunch of folks, beheading people on video and disseminating that out to the world. They're not a good bunch of people. Boy, this war on terror, they told us, they told us that this war was going to go on for a long time, but exactly how long should we let this war go on? We do see tremendous amount of instability taking place in the Middle East. Part of this is a result of of our wars there. A lot of this has to do with frustration of dictators. Many of these dictators, like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, were folks that whom we supported. Some of this has to do with democratic movements and labor movements that are existing in the Middle East, and then also we see other groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and other groups that are a little bit less lovable. Taking advantage of the instability that's going on in these areas. It also doesn't help the fact that in the name of this particular war on terror, the United States has committed some things that are kind of criminal. So, for instance, this is an image of a prisoner of war in Abu Ghraib who is being loosened up, and basically he's being tortured in order to presumably to get information from him. But the bottom line is these images get out there, and we see, well, wait a minute, the United States and the allies of the United States are torturing our people. And what kind of a position does this put American soldiers who may get caught? It's a pretty bad situation. Also, it makes it very, very difficult for governments that would like to maybe negotiate with the United States or work with the United States, like the current Iraqi government. And in doing so, because of this and because of for a variety of other reasons associated with this war on terrorism, the people of those countries don't want that. They feel that their governments are illegitimate when they do business with us. Of course, now we've escalated this war on terror. And this is something that President Obama has expanded significantly in his time in office. This is basically drones, or what I like to call flying killer robots. That we're doing an awful lot of this war on terror is now automated. And that is a whole new dimension of warfare. It's warfare by remote control. And to what extent is that going to change the nature of our conflicts in the future? Again, the answer to these questions is we don't know. We're going to have to leave it up to history to help us determine that. So we're also seeing another thing that we're seeing during this particular time period is a tremendous growth in anti-Muslim sentiment that's taking place in the United States. And I'm presuming that everybody who's watching this video now probably has a Facebook or some Twitter or some kind of a social media outlet all you have to do is click on it right now, and you will probably find some kind of a meme that is directed toward anti-Muslim, if you're in the United States, anti-Muslim content and context. Of course, what kind of a position does this put Muslims in the United States? How does this influence our policy? What if we have a policy in which we say, hey, maybe we should kind of loosen things up and maybe get along with folks in the Middle East a little bit better? What will this anti-Muslim movements do to influence that particular policy in a country in which elected officials still have to get votes? Again, we don't know the depth of the damage that's being done by this particular form of hate, but we do have a pretty good history of hate, and we do know that the outcomes are typically not good. Ongoing challenges that we're looking at right now. Of course, many of my students have just finished up filling in the bubbles. Hopefully they've filled in the appropriate bubbles, and they will have an appropriate grade on their bubbly tests. But is bubbles education? Well, of course not. But what is the role of bubbles in our education? Well, unfortunately, it's pretty tremendous. So it kind of begs to the question is, how do we educate everybody in the country and give them a decent education, and how do we do this most efficiently? And then how do we create an education system that is actually going to be competitive with education systems around the world, including many of those education systems in which we're not educating as many students. Especially when we consider that education is the one thing that could give us an economic edge over others. So education we're now kind of getting to the point where people are starting to look at a lot of the reforms that we've put into effect in the last 15 years and saying, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Maybe we should try something else. Well, what? What are we going to try? The role of technology in our society, where is all of this computation, all of these cell phones, all of these tablets and networking and all of this stuff going? And what are the consequences for human face-to-face interaction? We really don't know. Economic inequality still continues to plague us, especially in the United States, where economic inequality is expanding further and further. And then attach that to global inequality, the fact that the tablet that I am videoing this conversation on is made from components. Many of these components are actually the result of child labor, forced child labor in West Africa, which of course means that I am tied to that particular, form of labor exploitation. So what are my responsibilities now in that regard? And how do we deal with shifting migration patterns, immigrants coming in and out of the United States, and the changing nature of these immigrants? We're no longer looking at large numbers of European immigrants. Now our immigrants are coming from Central America and Asia mostly, and they're changing the cultural makeup of the United States, and this is a fearful thing for many people. Now this has happened before, and it was never really a problem, but it's always scary to the people who are facing change. Change is scary, and we are living in a time of very profound changes. This is relatively brief, and I know I've gone on for almost 15 minutes now, a very brief description of some of the challenges that we face in our immediate time. Now, this is why history is so important, because we can take a look at history, and this history can guide us into our futures. This history can be kind of a roadmap. Nobody can see the future, but we can take a look at the past and take a look at the direction that we've gone. We can take a look at the things that have worked and the things that haven't worked. And we can look at movements to liberate human beings and expand on those ideas. Either way, every generation has to deal with the historical cards that they get. These are your cards. Now, of course, I'm directing my speech to my students and to any other students who may be watching this. These are the cards that you have been handed. You have some good cards. You have technology, you have networks, you have democratic surveillance, you have all kinds of actual tools at your disposal that can serve to make the world better. You've also got some pretty crummy cards. You've got global warming, you've got economic injustice, you have growing instability in sections of the world. You have a changing economic system in which the stable jobs of the past are simply no longer there. There's your cards. Now it's up to you to play them.